Caleb Walker had not spoken a woman's name in 11 years. He had not needed to. The mountains asked nothing of him, and he had given them everything: his youth, his silence, his grief. But on the morning he rode into Millhaven, Colorado, something happened that no amount of mountain solitude had prepared him for. He saw a woman standing alone in the summer heat, surrounded by a crowd that was laughing at her. And without thinking, without planning a single word, he stepped off his horse and walked straight toward her. If a story like this one has ever made you feel something real, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came to Millhaven, Colorado like a punishment. A het pressed down on the valley with the kind of weight that made men mean and made the already mean men worse. Dust settled on everything: on the wagon wheels, on the storefronts, on the faces of people who had stopped expecting anything good from a day. The town sat at the base of the Rocky Mountains, like something the mountains had coughed out and decided wasn't worth keeping. 2 streets wide. One church that hadn't seen a full congregation in 3 years. A saloon that's seen too many. Caleb Walker rode in just before noon. He came down from his ranch in the high country, the way he always did at the beginning of every month, quiet, nay, purposeful, not looking for conversation. His horse, a dark bay gelding named Post, moved with the kind of steady patience that matched the man riding him. Caleb was 42 years old, though he looked like a man who had agreed to carry the weight of 42 years rather than simply lived through them. His shoulders were wide, his hands were scarred from rope work and cold weather, and 100 mornings of labor that no one had been there to see. Nay, he wore a dark brown hat that had been with him longer than most things in his life, and he wore it low, the way a man wears something he doesn't want to talk about. He had 3 things on his list: salt, a new length of fence wire. He was not on the list of anyone in Millhaven. That suited him fine. He tied Post to the rail in front of Gideon's trading post and was reaching into his saddlebag for his coin purse when he heard the noise. Not a fight, he knew the sound of a fight, and this wasn't it. This was laughter, the specific kind of laughter that doesn't mean anything is funny. The kind that comes from a group of people who have found someone smaller than themselves and decided to enjoy it. Caleb didn't turn around immediately. He pulled out his coin purse. He set it in his front pocket. He took a breath, then he turned around. The crowd had gathered in the open space between the trading post and the dry goods store. Maybe 30 people, maybe a few more, standing in a loose half circle the way people do when they want to watch something without admitting they're watching. Men in work clothes, women in bonnets, a handful of children who shouldn't have been there but were, because cruelty draws crowds the way water draws livestock. In the center of the half circle stood a woman. She was perhaps 26 or 27. She was wearing a plain cotton dress that had seen too many washings and not enough rest. She was holding a small canvas bag against her chest with both arms, holding it the way a person holds the last thing they own in the world when they know someone might try to take it. Her hair had come partly loose from its pins. Her face was flushed from the heat and from something else, something that had nothing to do with temperature. Standing across from her, red-faced and breathing hard through his nose, was a man Caleb didn't recognize. Heavy, somewhere in his 50s, wearing a vest that had cost more money than the woman's dress would ever cost, and wearing it like a man who wanted you to notice. He had the look of someone who had confused volume with authority for so long that he no longer knew the difference. "You will do what I tell you," the man was saying, loudly enough that the whole crowd could hear every word, which was clearly the point. "You don't have a choice, Evelyn. You never had a choice. You think you can just walk away from what you owe this family? You think that's something a person gets to do?" The woman, Evelyn, did not answer. She was looking at a spot on the ground about 3 feet in front of her, and her jaw was set in the way a jaw gets set when a person is working very hard, not to give someone the satisfaction of seeing them break. I'll tell you what you are, the man continued, and now his voice had dropped into something quieter and therefore meaner. Hey, you're a burden. You always have been. Your mother knew it. Nah, I know it. And now the whole town knows it too, nee. Because you are standing here in the street with nowhere to go and no one who wants you, and that is your own doing, Evelyn. That is the life you chose, when you decided you were too good for what was offered. Someone in the crowd laughed, a low sound, like something turned over in the dirt. Evelyn's chin came up slightly, just a fraction of an inch. Caleb noticed it. I don't owe you anything, Uncle Gerald, she said. Her voice was quieter than his, but it was steady. I never agreed to that arrangement. You know I never agreed to it. You agreed when you took food from my table for 3 years, Gerald said. Agreed when you slept under my roof. You think kindness is free, girl? Nothing is free. And now Mr. Hollis has been waiting 6 weeks for what he was promised. And you are going to stop this nonsense and... Ed, no. The crowd went quiet. Caleb was not entirely sure afterward at what point he had crossed the street. He didn't remember deciding to. Nah. He remembered turning around, and he remembered the woman's face. And then he was standing at the edge of the half-circle, and people were stepping back to let him through, whether they wanted to or not. As Caleb Walker at 42 was a man who occupied space in a way that did not invite argument. Upped about 10 feet from Gerald. He did not remove his hat because he was not here to be polite. He looked at the man directly. She said no, he repeated. That's a full sentence. It doesn't require anything added to it. Gerald stared at him. Who in the hell are you? Nobody important, Caleb said. That's sort of the point. Gerald's face darkened. He was a man who was used to being the largest presence in a room or in a street, and he did not appreciate the sensation of that changing. He looked Caleb up and down the way men do when they're deciding whether to be afraid. This is none of your business, Gerald said. This is a family matter. Away. I've walked away from a lot of things in my life, Caleb said. Some of them I regret. I'm trying to do better. He looked past Gerald to Evelyn. Ma'am, you need somewhere to be right now? Evelyn looked at him. Her eyes were dark, and they were wary, because a woman in her position had learned a long time ago that men who stepped forward usually wanted something in return. I don't know you, she said. No, ma'am. You don't? He kept his voice even. And I'm not asking you to. I'm asking if you need somewhere to stand that isn't here, in front of these people, while this man says things at you that you don't deserve to have said. Gerald took a step forward. Now listen here, I'm not talking to you, Caleb said, without looking at him. It landed. The crowd heard it. A few people shifted. Evelyn's grip on her canvas bag tightened. She looked at Caleb for a long moment, the kind of look that is doing real work behind the eyes, calculating, measuring, trying to determine whether one kind of danger is better or worse than another. My name is Evelyn Harper, she said finally. Caleb Walker. He tipped his chin slightly. I've got a ranch up the mountain. Got a spare room that isn't being used for anything. If you need a place to breathe while you figure out what comes next, you're welcome to it. No strings on that, none. Not in violence and noise. The overlapping, tumbling noise of 30 people, all deciding to have an opinion at once. He doesn't even know her. What kind of man just... She's ruined already, why would he... This ain't decent. Gerald's voice cut through all of it. You take her in, you take on everything that comes with her. You understand that? She's got debts, she's got enemies. She's got nothing, and she is nothing, and you will regret this before the week is out. Caleb looked at him for the first time since he'd stopped talking to him. I've been regretting things for 20 years, he said. And one more won't break me. He looked back at Evelyn. She was still watching him. The wariness was still there, it wasn't going anywhere, and he didn't expect it to. But there was something else now, something that sat behind the wariness, like a lamp behind a curtain. Small. Careful, not quite hope, because hope is something a person has to be able to afford. All right, she said quietly. She walked toward him, past Gerald, who grabbed her arm. Caleb moved before he thought about it. Not aggressively, he didn't raise a fist, didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped between Gerald's hand and Evelyn's arm, and he stood there. And he looked at Gerald with the particular expression of a man who has spent 40 years in the mountains and has run out of patience for things that don't have the decency to be honest about what they are. Gerald let go. "You'll be back," said, "both of you. Before the month is out, she'll be back and you'll wish you'd never set eyes on her." Caleb said nothing. He walked to where Post was tied, and he untied the reins, and he looked at Evelyn. "Can you ride? I can manage," she said. "Ride behind me, then." About 2 hours up. She looked at the horse. She looked at the crowd, which was still watching with the hungry attention of people who've found entertainment for an otherwise empty afternoon. She looked at Gerald, who was standing in the street with his hands at his sides, and his face arranged in some promised, this wasn't finished. Then she put her foot in the stirrup and got up behind Caleb, and she sat straight, and she did not look at any of them as they rode out. They had been riding for maybe 20 minutes before Evelyn spoke. "You have to do that." "No," Caleb agreed. "Most men wouldn't have." "No." She was quiet for a moment. "Why did you?" He thought about it. He was a man who didn't speak without thinking, and he didn't think without meaning it, and so he took his time. "Because you were standing there holding on to that bag like it was the only thing you had," he said. "Yeah. And you weren't crying, and you weren't begging, and I thought she shouldn't have to be that strong right now, in front of all those people. Nobody should have to be that strong just to stand still." Evelyn didn't say anything to that. He didn't expect her to. The ranch sat on a wide shelf of mountain land, about halfway up a pine-covered slope that looked out over the valley below. Caleb had built most of it himself, over the course of 15 years, which meant it was solid and functional, and almost entirely without decoration. Main cabin, a barn that held 6 horses and smelled like hay and honest work. A root cellar, a garden plot that was more ambition than reality. When they rode in, horses in the barn called out, and Post answered. And Caleb swung down and held the stirrup steady for Evelyn, who got down without his help, which he noted without comment. "Room's through there," he said, nodding toward the cabin door. "It's clean. Not much in it, but it's clean." Evelyn looked at the cabin. She looked at the garden plot. She looked at the view, which was, whether you wanted it to be or not, extraordinary. The whole valley spread out below, golden in the afternoon light, the kind of view that made you feel like you were standing somewhere that mattered. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 15 years, he said. Alone, he confirmed. She turned and looked at him with that steady, measuring expression she had, and he realized he was going to have to get used to it, because it did not appear to be something she did occasionally. It appeared to be something she did as a matter of survival. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I need you to understand something." "All right. I am not here to be grateful," she said. "I am not here to be convenient or useful, or to make myself small so you don't regret doing what you did. I am here because I needed somewhere to be, and you offered, and I took it. But I am not in your debt. I won't operate like I'm in your debt. If that's a problem, I'd rather know now." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "Miss Harper," he said, "I spent 15 years up here building something that has exactly 1 person in it. I'm not looking for gratitude. I don't even know what I'd do with it." A beat. Something shifted, almost invisibly, in her expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a fractional easing. The kind that happens when a person realizes that the ground standing on might not give way the moment they stop bracing for it. "All right," she said. She walked into the cabin. The town did not leave it alone. By the following morning, the story had been told and retold in every corner of Millhaven, and it had grown in the retelling the way stories always grow, when they are fed by people who want them to mean something other than what actually happened. In the version going around the saloon, Caleb Walker had lost his mind. "Mountain loneliness does something to a man," someone was saying. "You spend enough years up there by yourself, you start making decisions that don't make sense." And in the version going around the church, Evelyn Harper had orchestrated the whole thing. She knew what she was doing. A woman in a white bonnet said to two others, "I always said she was too clever. Girls like that know how to make a man feel like a hero." Gerald Marsh, because that was his name, Gerald Marsh. And he was not simply a loud man in a vest, but the owner of the largest cattle operation in the valley and a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, through either money or reputation, or both. Gerald Marsh sat in the office of his ranch and said nothing to anyone for a full hour after Caleb and Evelyn rode out. Then he called in his foreman, a lean, sun-dried man named Cotton Briggs, and said, "Find out everything there is to know about Caleb Walker." Cotton nodded, and then Gerald said, "We'll see how long his charity holds." Up the mountain, Evelyn was in the kitchen. Not because she had been asked to be. Not because she thought it was her role. But because she had gone through Caleb's provisions with the practical eye of a woman who had managed households out of almost nothing, and what she found was a situation that explained a great deal about the man. He had flour, but it was old. He had salt and dried beans and a side of salt pork. He had coffee that he made too strong and a pot that he had clearly been using as both a coffee pot and a bean pot without washing it thoroughly between the two purposes. He had no sugar. He had no dried fruit. He had the food of a man who viewed eating as a task to be completed rather than an experience to be had. She found a cast-iron skillet behind a pile of rope on a shelf, good, heavy, and well-seasoned, which meant he'd had it for years and used it, and then, for some reason, stopped and she took it down, and she made cornbread, which was the most sensible thing she could make from what was available, and she made it well. Caleb came in from the barn at midday and stopped when he smelled it. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression of a man who has forgotten something important and is only now being reminded that it existed. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She was echoing his words from the ride up, and from the way the corner of her mouth moved, she knew it too. He sat down. They ate without talking much, which was fine with both of them. There was a quality to the silence, though it was not the silence of two strangers who have nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who are each quietly revising the assumptions they arrived with. After a while, Caleb said, "That skillet was my mother's." "I know," Evelyn said. "You can tell by the seasoning." "Someone cared for it." "She did." He looked at the skillet for a moment. "She's been gone a long time. I'm sorry, don't be." He said it gently, without sharpness. It was long enough ago that it settled. Just hadn't thought about it in a while. Evelyn looked at him across the table. "What happened to the woman who was supposed to be here with you?" she asked. "There had to have been one. Nobody takes this much care building something by themselves unless they built it for someone." The directness of the question should have been startling. It wasn't, quite, because it matched the directness of everything else about her. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "She chose someone else," he said. 20 years ago, man with more to offer. Can't say she was wrong, he did have more to offer. I had land and intentions, and not a great deal besides. And so you stayed, and so I stayed, and you built it anyway. Seemed like the thing to do, he said. The land didn't care about my circumstances. The horses didn't care. The work needed doing either way. Evelyn nodded slowly. "That's either very strong," she said, "or very sad." "Probably both," he said. She looked at him, that long, measuring look. And then she said something that surprised him. "Me too," she said. Both. 3 days passed. A week. Evelyn worked. She worked the way she'd worked her whole life, which was to say constantly and without being asked, because that was what survival had required of her. She repaired a hinge on the barn door that had been half off for long enough that Caleb had stopped noticing it. She organized the root cellar. She planted 3 rows of late-season beans in the garden plot, which was ambitious given the time of year, but not impossible if the first frost held off, which in this part of Colorado it sometimes did. She also spent time with the horses. Caleb noticed this first. He watched her, the first morning, stand at the fence of the paddock for about 15 minutes without moving. just watching the horses move around each other and then slowly reach out her hand, flat, and fingers down, and wait. And wait. Until a sorrel mare named Sunday, who had been skittish since a bad experience with a previous rider and who Caleb had been working with patiently for 3 months, came over and put her nose against Evelyn's palm. He didn't say anything. She didn't know he was watching. That day, she was brushing Sunday's neck and talking to her in a low voice, and even though Caleb couldn't hear what she was saying, he could see the horse's ears. And Sunday's ears were forward and soft in a way they hadn't been since she arrived. At dinner, he said, "How'd you learn to do that? With horses?" Evelyn glanced up. "Learn to do what? Make them trust you?" She thought about it. "I don't know that I learned it. I think I understand what it feels like to not trust something. And I understand what it feels like when something gives you a reason not to be afraid." She paused. "I try to be that. For them, the reason." Caleb looked at his plate. "That's a good way to be," he said. On the 8th day, Cotton Briggs rode up. Caleb was in the paddock when he saw the rider coming up the mountain trail, and he recognized the horse before he recognized the man. And he recognized the horse because he'd seen it tied outside Gerald Marsh's barn enough times to know whose remuda it came from. He walked out to the front of the cabin and waited. Cotton rode in easy casual, like a man stopping by for social reasons, which both of them understood he was not. He pulled up and looked down at Caleb from the saddle with the expression of a man who is delivering something unpleasant and has made his peace with it. "Walker Briggs. Gerald Marsh sends his regards." "You don't want them," Cotton smiled. It was not a warm smile. "He figured you'd say something like that. He also says to tell you that the girl Miss Harper, she's carrying debt she didn't tell you about. $20 to the dry goods store. Another 20 to a man named P.D. Dunn, who is not a patient man and who will come looking sooner or later regardless of where she's hiding." "She's not hiding," Caleb said. "She's working. There's a difference." Maybe so." Cotton looked around the ranch with the practiced eye of a man who appraises things for a living. "Nice setup. Be a shame if things got complicated." He looked back at Caleb. "Mr. Marsh is a reasonable man. He'd be willing to settle Miss Harper's debts himself, all of them, and make sure P.D. Dunn stays away in exchange for her coming back to town and honoring the arrangement she broke." Caleb let a beat pass. "And what arrangement is that exactly?" he said. "Because from where I was standing in that street, what I heard was a man trying to force a woman into something she'd already said no to." Cotton shifted slightly in the saddle. "That's a strong characterization of a family matter." "It's an accurate one. Mr. Marsh won't like hearing this." "I know," Caleb said. "Tell him I said so anyway." Cotton looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Quieter, Walker. Gerald Marsh can make things hard for a man up here. Raising rights, water access, a man living alone on a mountain that's a vulnerable position. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you the way the ground lies." "I've been on this mountain 15 years, Caleb said. "I know every inch of the ground," Cotton exhaled. He looked for just a moment like a man who was tired of his employer's business and would rather be somewhere else. Then the look closed. "All right," he said. He turned the horse. "Don't say you weren't told." He rode back down the mountain. Caleb stood and watched him go. He went back into the cabin. Evelyn was at the table, sewing a tear in one of her dresses, and she looked up when he came in. "That was Gerald's man," she said. It wasn't a question. She put the sewing down. "What did he say?" Caleb sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at her directly, because she deserved that. "He said you've got debt in town. $40 at the dry goods. 20 to someone named P.D. Dunn." She didn't flinch. "That's true," she said. "I was going to tell you." "You didn't have to tell me, I know, but I was going to." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't take those debts carelessly. The dry goods debt was food I needed when Gerald stopped allowing me to eat at his table after I refused the arrangement. The Dunn debt was for my mother's medicine 3 years ago, before she died. I've been paying it back a little at a time." She paused. I'm not careless with money. I just don't have any. Caleb nodded slowly. Gerald offered to clear both debts, he said. In exchange for you going back. Her jaw tightened. And what did you say? I told him no. She looked at him. Yeah. Something moved in her expression, deep, complicated. The kind of thing that happens when a person has been waiting a long time for something, and then it arrives, and they don't quite know what to do with it yet. You don't even know me, she said. Not really. We've had a week. I know enough, he said. Enough for what? Enough to know that the debt Gerald's offering to clear isn't actually about money, he said. And enough to know that whatever he's offering you costs more than it's worth. He looked at her. $60 I can settle it, if you'll allow it. Not as a gift and not as a debt, as a settlement. We clear it, and then whatever comes next, you start from a level place. Evelyn stared at him. Caleb, she said. And it was the first time she'd used his first name, and they both noticed it. He was quiet for a moment. Because you are exactly what you told me you were, he said. The day we arrived here. You said you weren't here to be convenient, or to make yourself small, or to operate like you're in debt. And you haven't been. Every single day you have been exactly what you said. He looked at the table. I have been around a great many people in my life who were not what they said. It makes a person cautious about hoping for things. And you're hoping for something? She asked carefully. Not asking for anything, he said quickly. That's not what I mean. He stopped, looked for the right words in the way a man looks who doesn't use many words and knows how much each one counts. I want you to have a level place to stand. Whatever you decide to do from there is yours to decide. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You're a very strange man, Caleb Walker. Probably, he said. I don't mean it as an insult. I didn't take it as one. She picked up her sewing again. Her hands moved for a moment, needle and thread, before she said, Nay. Without looking up, Gerald isn't going to stop. No, and Petey Dunn is genuinely unpleasant. You should know that. I've met unpleasant men before. Not like Petey. He almost smiled. All right, not like Petey. Nan. She looked up then, and there was something in her face that was different from any expression he'd seen there yet. It was not the wariness. It was not the measuring look. It was something smaller and quieter, and therefore more significant, like a door opened. Just the narrowest crack. Thank you, she said, for what you did in the street. And for this. I'm not saying it because I feel like I owe it. I'm saying it because it's true. I know, he said. That's why it means something. She looked at him for another moment. Then she went back to her sewing, and Caleb went back to the barn. The mountain held them both, indifferent and enormous and old. Mountains do while down in the valley. Gerald Marsh sat in his office and turned a pen over and over in his fingers. And thought about how to make a man who didn't want anything into a man who could be moved. The morning after Cotton Briggs rode back down the mountain, Caleb settled the debt. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask Evelyn's permission a second time. She'd given it the night before with a nod that was more complicated than any yes he'd ever received. He rode into Millhaven alone early, before most of the town had finished its first cup of coffee, and he walked into the dry goods store and put $40 on the counter in front of a startled man named Holcomb. And he said, This clears Evelyn Harper's account. I want a receipt. Holcomb wrote the receipt with the careful penmanship of a man who wasn't sure he was doing the right thing but was absolutely sure he was going to do it anyway. Because $40 was $40. Then Caleb found Petey Dunn. That took a little longer, because Petey Dunn was not a man who kept regular hours or predictable locations. He was the kind of man, margin, not quite criminal, not quite legitimate, operating in the space between where other men's rules didn't quite reach. Caleb found him behind the livery, doing something with a knife and a piece of wood that he put away quickly when Caleb walked up. You're done, Caleb said. Petey looked him over. He was a smaller man than his reputation suggested, wiry, quick-eyed, with the kind of stillness that isn't calm but is the thing that happens just before something moves fast. Caleb Walker, I'm settling a debt. Evelyn Harper. Petey tilted his head. Miss Harper's debt isn't the kind that gets settled by a third party. It is now, Caleb said. What's the number? The number is that Miss Harper and I had an arrangement, and an arrangement isn't just money. Caleb looked at him steadily. Then I need you to explain what the arrangement is, plainly, so I understand what I'm dealing with. He smiled slowly. It was a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. The arrangement is that she comes to me when I say so, and she does what I ask, and eventually the debt goes away. That's how it works with me. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when something has been said out loud that everyone in a situation already knew but nobody had put words to yet. How much to make that arrangement go away entirely? Caleb said. Not the 20, all of it. Petey studied him. You're serious. I don't make the trip down the mountain to not be serious. 80 named a number. It was not $20. It was not a reasonable number by any measure Caleb had. He looked at Petey for a long moment, and then he said, half that. And I'll forget this conversation happened. All of it. Including the part where you explained your arrangement. Petey went very still. That sounds like a threat, Petey said. It's a business offer, Caleb said, with a time limit. Take it or don't. Petey took it. And Caleb rode back up the mountain, with receipts in his pocket and less money than he'd started the day with, and the particular feeling of a man who has done a thing he does not regret, but is not entirely comfortable with either, because he had not. Wanted to know what he now knew about the arrangement Evelyn had been living under, and knowing it made something settle cold and hard in his chest. He didn't tell her all of it when he got back. He told her the debts were cleared. He gave her both receipts. He said, "You're starting from a level place now." Like we said. She took the receipts and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Petey didn't just take the money, did he?" Wasn't a question. It's handled, said Caleb. She looked up at him. What did he say to you? A beat. Nothing that matters anymore. Her expression did something. He hadn't seen it do yet. Nay. It collapsed, briefly, not into tears, into something underneath tears. The thing that comes before a person decides whether to let themselves feel something or fold it back up and put it away. She folded it back up. But he'd seen it, and she knew he'd seen it, and that was its own kind of thing between them now. All right, she said quietly. Thank you, don't thank me, he said. Just let it be done. And it was done. Or it was supposed to be. What neither of them knew was that Petey Dunn, Etheman, after Caleb rode back up the mountain, walked directly to Gerald Marsh's office and sat down across the desk and said, "Mountain Cowboy, just bought out Harper's debt. All of it. Paid more than it was worth to make sure I had no more claim on her." Gerald listened to this without expression. How much did he pay? Gerald asked. Meady told him. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A man doesn't spend that kind of money on a woman he's known for a week unless he's already decided something." That's what I thought, Petey said. Then we need to change what he's decided, Gerald said. Leaned back. And to do that, we need to give him a reason to see her differently. Up on the mountain, the days kept moving the way days do when a person has work to fill them, and work has a way of making time honest. Evelyn had taken on the horses as her project, without anyone assigning it to her, and without her asking whether it was all right. She simply began, the way she began everything practically, observantly, without wasted motion. She worked with Sunday every morning until the mare's skittishness had settled into something closer to preference, which is different from trust but is the first step toward it. She worked with a younger gelding named Wick, who had a habit of leaning on the fence when tied, which was a bad habit for reasons Caleb hadn't gotten around to addressing, and she addressed it with the kind of patient consistency that does not raise its voice. And Caleb watched all of this various distances and said very little about it, which was his way of saying a great deal. They developed a routine, the way two people develop a routine when they are each trying very hard not to impose on the other, which is to say, accidentally, and then, deliberately, once they realized the accident was working. Caleb cooked supper. Evelyn cooked breakfast. Neither had discussed this arrangement. It simply emerged over about 4 days and then solidified without a word being spoken about it, because some things don't need to be spoken. On the 12th day, Caleb came into the kitchen breakfast and found her standing at the stove with Sunday's lead rope in one hand and a skillet in the other, talking to a woman he had never seen before. He stopped in the doorway. The woman was about 60, small and sharp-eyed, wearing a blue dress that had been good quality about 10 years ago, and a hat that had been good quality longer ago than that. She was sitting at Caleb's kitchen table with the ease of someone who had been invited, and she was looking at Evelyn with the expression of a woman who has been watching something develop and has decided to have an opinion about it. "This is Margaret Tilden," Evelyn said, turning from the stove. She said it the way you introduce someone, when you have been hoping to delay the introduction for a little while longer. "She owns the millinery on the east end of town. She came up this morning." Margaret Tilden looked at Caleb with sharp, measuring eyes. "Sit down," she said, as though it were her kitchen. The Caleb sat down, because something about Margaret Tilden made sitting down seem like the reasonable option. "I want you to know," Margaret said, "that not everyone in that town thinks what Gerald Marsh thinks. And not everyone who stood there in the street and said nothing was saying nothing because they agreed with him. Some of us were saying nothing because we've learned that the loudest voice in Millhaven belongs to the man who can make your life most difficult, and most of us can't afford to make our lives more difficult." Caleb said, "I appreciate you saying so. I'm not here to make you feel better about Millhaven," Margaret said briskly. "I'm here because I like this girl, and I have liked her for 3 years, and I want her to know that she has a friend in that town who is not afraid of Gerald Marsh's opinions." She looked at Evelyn. "That said, I also came to tell you something you need to know." Evelyn put the skillet down. She turned around fully. "What?" Margaret folded her hands on the table. "Gerald's been talking. People who matter in this valley. He's saying you stole from him before you left. Not saying it loud yet, he's planting it, the way he does. Word here, a word there. Until the ground is so prepared that when he says the full thing, people already half believe it." Silence in the kitchen went hard. "I didn't steal anything," Evelyn said. "Know that," Margaret said. "And you know that. But Gerald Marsh has been in this valley for 20 years and you have been in it for 3. And the people who owe him favors outnumber the people who owe you anything by a considerable margin." She looked between Evelyn and Caleb. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you so you're not surprised when it arrives." Caleb looked at the table. He was thinking. He was the kind of man who thought visibly, not because his gave much away, but because the stillnesses around him changed quality when he was working through something. "What exactly is he saying she took?" he asked. "A ledger," Margaret said. He's saying she took a financial ledger from his office before she left. He's saying it contained records of transactions he'd rather not have made public, and that she took it as insurance." Evelyn's eyes went sharp. "He knows I don't have any ledger." "I've never been inside his office." "He knows that," Margaret said quietly. "That's not the point of the story." The point of the story landed in the room and sat there. "He doesn't need the ledger to exist," Caleb said. "He just needs people to wonder if it does." "That's exactly right," Margaret said. Stood straightening her hat. "I've said what I came to say. You're both smart enough to know what to do with it." She paused at the door and looked back at Evelyn. "You have more people in your corner than you know, girl. But the ones in your corner are quieter than the ones in his. That's not a fair arrangement. But that's the arrangement." She left. The kitchen held them for a moment in the kind of silence that follows something important. "He's going to try to make me a criminal," Evelyn said. Her voice was even, too even, the kind of even that requires work. "He's going to try," Caleb said. "Doesn't mean he'll succeed." "Caleb." She looked at him. "This is going to get worse. Every time you hold your ground, he escalates. That's who he is. I know him. I lived in his house for 3 years. The man does not accept the word no, he just changes his method until no starts to seem more expensive than yes. And we make sure the cost of his methods is higher than the cost of ours, Caleb said. What does that look like? He looked at her directly. It looks like we don't do anything wrong, and we don't give him anything true to work with. And we make sure the people who know better have a reason to say so. Evelyn stared at him. That's actually a sound strategy. I've been on a mountain for 15 years, he said. I've had time to think about how people work. Something moved in her face, that small, careful thing she kept behind her wariness. It moved closer to the surface. All right, she said. Then we do it your way. 2 days later, Petey Dunn came up the mountain. He did not come alone. He brought 2 men with him that Caleb did not know, and they rode in mid-afternoon on horses that were not quality horses, but were large enough. And they stopped in the yard in front of the cabin, while Caleb was splitting firewood, and Evelyn was in the paddock with Sunday. Put the axe down. He did not pick it back up. He walked to the fence that separated the yard from the open space, and he stood there and waited. Rode up to about 10 feet and stopped. Walker. Done. The agreement we made said you were done. I had time to reconsider the terms, Petey said pleasantly. I think we undervalued what I was letting go of. The receipt says otherwise. The receipt. Petey smiled. Right, about that. See, a receipt is a piece of paper. And paper, he shrugged. Paper's a fragile thing. The men with Petey laughed. What do you want? Caleb said flatly. Miss Harper. Just to talk. Gerald's got an offer he thinks she'll find more reasonable now that she's had time to think about her situation clearly. Miss Harper isn't available, Walker. She isn't available, Caleb said again. The same way, no louder. The man on Petey's left shifted in his saddle. The other one moved his horse a step sideways, which was a positioning move, and both of them knew it. Looked at that man, then at the other one, then back at Petey. I want you to think carefully, Caleb said, about what you are doing right now. Yeah. I want you to think about what you came up here to do, and what it would mean to do it, and whether the amount Gerald Marsh is paying you is sufficient for what comes after. Petey tilted his head. Is that a threat? It's the same question I asked you before. Answered it right last time. The man on the left had moved his horse another half step. He looked at him without moving his head, just his eyes, and the man stopped. From inside the paddock, Sunday made a sound, a sharp, short call, the kind horses make when something has their attention. Caleb didn't know what it meant. Get off my land, Caleb said. Quiet, final, the kind of quiet that is its own kind of loud. Petey looked at him for a long moment. He was calculating. Caleb could see it weighing the present against the future, the money against the risk, the man in front of him against whatever Gerald Marsh had told him about the man in front of him. Gerald had been wrong about something. Petey could see that now. He pulled his horse back. He looked at his men. He looked back at Caleb one more, Wispameister, an expression that was trying to preserve something that had already been lost. This isn't finished, Petey said. No, Caleb agreed. It isn't. They rode back down. Caleb stood in the yard until they were out of sight. Then he heard Evelyn's footsteps behind him, and he turned. She had come out of the paddock. She had seen. She was looking at him with an expression that had several things in it, none of them simple. He'll come back, she said. Yes, with more men. Probably. And then what? He looked at her. Then I'll need you to trust me. She held his gaze for a long moment. I do, she said. That's the thing. I don't know when that happened, but I do. He didn't have a response for that felt equal to it. Yeah, so he said good, and she almost smiled. The almost was enough for now. That evening, 2 things happened. The first was that Margaret Tilden sent a boy up the mountain with a note. Note said, Gerald filed a complaint with the county recorder today. He claims Evelyn stole property from his household. No formal charge yet, but the machinery is moving. The second thing was that Caleb sat down at his table after Evelyn had gone to her room, and he wrote a letter. He He wrote it to a man named Daniel Forsyth, who was a territorial land attorney in Denver and who Caleb had done a favor for about 8 years ago, that the man had always said he would return. He wrote it carefully, the way he did everything carefully, and he told Forsyth what was happening, and he asked for advice, and then he folded the letter and sealed it and set it on the table to send in the morning. He sat in the quiet of the cabin for a while after that. The fire was burning low. Outside, the mountain held its enormous silence, the pines, the wind, dark sky, with its extravagant population of stars that you could only really see from this high up. He thought about what Evelyn had said. I do. I don't know when that happened, but I do. And he thought about the fact that he had 15 years on this mountain building, something that he had been telling himself was sufficient: the land, the work, the horses, the honest daily rhythm of a life. He had told himself that was enough, and it had been enough in the way that enough always is, barely, quietly, without joy, but without lack either. He thought about how different the cabin felt now than it had 3 weeks ago. He thought about the skillet on the hook by the stove, and the beans in the garden, and Sunday's ears going soft when Evelyn stood at the fence. He thought about the look on Evelyn's face in the street in Millhaven, the way she was holding on to that bag, the way her chin had come up. Not expected any of this. He was not sure even now what any of this was. But he was absolutely certain, with the kind of certainty that a man develops when he has been honest with himself long enough to know what it feels like, that he was not going to let Gerald Marsh win. In the morning, Evelyn came to the kitchen and found the letter on the table and Caleb already at the stove. She picked up the letter and looked at the address. "Who is Daniel Forsyth?" she asked. "A lawyer in Denver," Caleb said. "A good one, and I trust him." She set the letter back down carefully. "You're already 3 steps ahead of where I thought we were." "I've been thinking about it since Margaret's visit." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why are you doing this? And I need you to be honest with me." Not kind. Honest. He turned from the stove. He looked at her directly, the way he'd been looking at her from the beginning, without apology, without performance. "Because you're worth it," he said. "And because whatever this is," he started again. "Because I don't want to know what this place feels like when you're not in it." Kitchen was very still. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. "Is possibly the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said finally. "I told you I'd be honest." "You did." She looked at the letter, then back at him. "All right, Caleb Walker, then let's fight." The letter went out with the morning rider. Forsyth's reply came back 5 days later, and it was longer than Caleb had expected and more detailed, and it outlined 3 specific legal strategies for contesting a fraudulent property claim in territorial court, including a mechanism for requiring Gerald Marsh to produce documentary evidence to support his accusation, which Forsyth suspected, correctly, that Marsh could not produce, because the accusation was false. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he brought it to Evelyn, who read it 3 times and then put it flat on the table and pressed her palms against it as if she was trying to feel whether it was real. "Can do this," she said. "He says he can, and you trust him." "With my life," Caleb said, "which is effectively what we're doing." She looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way he hadn't seen before, not tears, but something adjacent to tears, the thing that happens when a person who has been fighting alone for a very long time suddenly realizes they might not be alone anymore. "It'll cost money," she said. "Attorney's fees, travel." "I have money," Caleb said. "Caleb, I have been living alone on a mountain for 15 years, he said. "I am a man of extremely modest expenses. I have money." She stared at him. Then she did something he had not yet seen her do. She laughed. It was brief, surprised out of her, the way laughter sometimes is, and it transformed her face into something he hadn't seen there yet, something that was purely and completely unguarded. And it lasted only a moment before she pulled it back, a little embarrassed by it. Had seen it, and the cabin already changed again. That was the afternoon Gerald Marsh came himself. He did not bring Cotton Briggs. He did not bring Petey Dunn. He came alone, which was its own kind of statement, the kind that says I don't need men to do this, because this is not that kind of conversation. He tied his horse at the fence and walked to the door and knocked, 3 times, with the measured knock of a man who is accustomed to doors opening when he asks them to. Caleb opened the door. He stepped outside, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. Gerald looked older in the afternoon light than he had in the street. Still powerful, there was still that quality about him, the accumulated weight of a man who has gotten his way for a long time. But there was something around his eyes that hadn't been there before, or that Caleb hadn't noticed. Walker, Gerald said, I think we should talk, man to man. Without the history between us. All right, Caleb said. Talk. Gerald looked at him. You sent a letter to Daniel Forsyth in Denver. Caleb said nothing. I have friends in Denver, Gerald said simply. I want you to understand something. Forsyth is good. He's very good, but this valley is mine. I have built 20 years of relationships in this territory, and I have the ear of the county recorder, and I have debts outstanding from men who sit on the circuit court. You can fight me. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying that winning is a different matter. What are you offering? Caleb said. Gerald looked almost relieved. I'm offering to let this go. Evelyn goes back to town. She honors the arrangement. And I want to be clear. The arrangement I'm speaking of is a business arrangement, not anything improper. Whatever she may have told you. She hasn't told me anything that matches what you're describing, Caleb said. Gerald stopped. She's told me she refused, Caleb said. She's told me she was clear about refusing. And from what I understand of the situation, that should have been the end of it. He looked at Gerald steadily. You have 20 years in this valley. I've had 15 on this mountain. I know something about patience, and I know something about a man who thinks longevity is the same as being right. A pause. It isn't. Being right is being right. Longevity just means you've had more time to be wrong. Gerald's expression did not change, but something behind it did. You're making a mistake, Gerald said. I've made mistakes before, Caleb said. None of them that I've regretted as much as the things I didn't do. Gerald held his gaze for a long, flat moment. Then he put his hat back on. He had taken it off, which Caleb registered as a calculation, not a courtesy, and he turned and walked back to his horse. At the fence, he stopped. Without turning around, he said, She's going to cost you everything, Walker. I want you to know I told you that. I know, Caleb said. I'll remember. Gerald rode away. Caleb stood in the yard until the sound of the horse was gone. Then the cabin door opened behind him, and Evelyn's stepped out. She had heard. Of course she had heard. She came to stand beside him, not in front of him, not behind him. Beside him, looking out at where Gerald had gone. After a long moment, she said, He's going to come at us hard now. Caleb said, Are you afraid? He considered it honestly. Not of him, he said. Of losing ground I can't get back. That's a different kind of afraid. She was quiet for a moment. Then we don't lose it, she said. It was simple. It was also, said the way she said it, one of the most clarifying things he had ever heard. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and up in the high Colorado summer, in the wide, clean air above the valley. Something shifted between them that had been building since the moment he stepped forward in a dusty street, and she said no something that neither of them had named yet, and both of them knew was there. Patient as the mountain, waiting for them to be ready. They weren't ready yet, but they were getting there. And Gerald Marsh, riding back down to the valley with 20 years of influence and a plan that was already forming behind his eyes, had made one miscalculation. He had assumed Evelyn Harper was the weakness. He had not yet understood that she was the reason Caleb Walker, for the first time in 15 years, had something worth fighting for. That mistake was going to cost him. Forsyth's second letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. Caleb read it standing at the table, still in his work coat, trailed dust on his boots, because the morning rider had caught him coming out of the barn, and he hadn't even made it inside before he broke the seal. Evelyn watched him read it. She watched his face, because she had learned in the past 3 weeks that Caleb Walker's face was not a face that gave things away easily, but it gave them away to someone who knew how to look. Looked up. Forsyth found something, he said. Me. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. He put the letter on the table, and she read it standing beside him, close enough that he could hear her breathing change as she got to the middle of the page. Forsyth had done more than outline legal strategies. He had done what good lawyers do when a client gives them a name and a grievance, and enough time he had pulled the thread. Gerald Marsh's land holdings in the valley, which everyone accepted as legitimate because they had been accepted as legitimate for 20 years, contained a parcel in the northwest corner that had been acquired in 1871 through a sale that Forsyth described carefully and with citation as potentially irregular. The original homesteader, a man named Alton Reeves, had signed over the deed 6 weeks after being declared mentally incompetent by a county recorder who, it turned out, had received a land gift from Gerald Marsh approximately 3 months prior. Evelyn finished reading. She straightened up slowly. She said, "Forsyth says potentially," Caleb said. "Forsyth is a lawyer. He says potentially because that's how lawyers say yes." She looked at the letter again. "This is how he built everything. This is where it started." "It's where we start," Caleb said. "If Forsyth can get the territorial records, if the chain of title holds, it will hold," Evelyn said with a certainty that made Caleb look at her. "I used to hear Gerald talk. Not to me, he didn't talk to me. But a house has thin walls, and a man who thinks a woman isn't listening will say things he'd never say to a room full of men." She met his eyes. "I heard him talking to Cotton Briggs once, late at night, when they thought I was asleep. He was talking about the Reeves land. He said the old man had been easier to move than he expected. He used those words, easier to move. The kitchen went very still." "You heard that," Caleb said, 3 years ago. "I didn't know what it meant then. I was new to the house, and I thought maybe it was a business negotiation that went well." She paused. "I know now." Caleb looked at her steadily. "Evelyn, that's testimony. I know what it is. It puts you in a difficult position." "I'm already in a difficult position," she said. "I might as well be in it for a reason that matters." He held her gaze. There was something happening in his chest that he had mostly stopped being able to ignore, and this moment did not help with that. Nah. She was standing there, steady and clear-eyed and absolutely unafraid, which was either the bravest thing he had ever seen or the most heartbreaking he hadn't decided, which, because it was both. "All right," he said. "I'll write to Forsyth today." "Yeah." She nodded. "Nee." Then she said quietly, "He's not going to let this sit, Caleb. When he finds out we're pulling at the Reeves land." "He'll move fast," Caleb agreed. "How fast?" He was honest. "Faster than we're ready for." She absorbed that. "Then we get ready faster." Nee. He wrote the letter that morning. By afternoon it was gone with the writer. What came up the mountain that same afternoon was not what either of them expected. It was a boy, 12, maybe 13, riding a mule that was too big for him, coming up the trail at a pace that suggested urgency without quite achieving it. Caleb saw him from the paddock and walked out to meet him at the gate. He pulled up, breathing hard, and held out a folded piece of paper. "Man in town told me to bring this up. Said it was important. Said to give it only to the woman." Caleb took the paper. Boy held his ground. "Said only to the woman," the boy repeated. Caleb looked at the boy for a moment, then turned and called toward the cabin. Evelyn came out and crossed the yard, and Caleb handed her the paper without a word. She opened it, read it, and then the color went out of her face in the specific way that happens when someone receives news they already feared, but had been hoping not to receive. "What is it?" Caleb said. She handed it to him without speaking. Note was from Margaret Tilden. It said, "Gerald filed the formal theft charge this morning with the county recorder. It goes to the circuit judge on Friday. There is a warrant being prepared for Evelyn's arrest. You have 3 days. Get a lawyer to Millhaven before Friday, or she goes to jail regardless of the truth. I am sorry. I tried to warn you sooner. There is one more thing Gerald knows about the Reeves land. Someone told him Forsyth is looking. He is furious and he is moving. Nell. Caleb read it twice. 3 days. He looked at Evelyn. She was standing very straight, the way she always stood when the world was doing something to her that she had not consented to and could not immediately stop. "It's a be all right," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "Yeah. Don't say that when you don't know if it's true." He stopped. She was right. He did not know if it was true. "Then here's what I know is true," he said. "Forsyth needs to be here by Thursday. I need to send a rider to Denver tonight. I need to." Stopped himself. Slowed down. Because she wasn't looking for a plan yet. She was standing there in the yard with a note that said she might go to jail for something she didn't do, and she was trying not to come apart, and what she needed before any plan was something steadier than a plan. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. "You're not going to jail," he said. Not a reassurance, a declaration, the kind that doesn't leave room for argument. Something in her face shifted. Not relief, she was too honest for premature relief. But something that looked, from the right angle, like not being alone. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed. He sent the fastest rider he could find to Denver before dark. Elton came up the mountain the next morning before 8 o'clock, which told Caleb how serious she thought the situation was, because Margaret Tilden did not rush for anything that wasn't genuinely worth rushing for. She came in, sat down at the kitchen table, accepted a cup of coffee, and got straight to the point. "Gerald moved faster than I expected," she said. "He's been building the charge for 2 weeks quietly, the way he builds everything. He has 3 witnesses who will say they saw Evelyn in his office the day she left. Those witnesses are men who owe Gerald money or favors, which means they'll say whatever he needs them to say." "False witnesses," Evelyn said. "False as a $3 bill," Margaret said flatly. "But believable in a court where the judge has eaten at Gerald's table more than once." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "There are, however, people in this town who have seen enough of Gerald Marsh's methods over the years that they would speak against him if they believed there was any chance of doing so safely." Caleb leaned forward. "How many enough?" Margaret said. "Maybe." Holcomb from the dry goods Gerald pressured him into raising Evelyn's debt figure before she left, and Holcomb has felt bad about it ever since. "There's a woman named Ruth Ferris whose husband lost land to Gerald in a card game that wasn't a card game. She paused. "There's Alton Reeves's daughter. 80. She lives on the east edge of town. She's never spoken about what happened to her father's land because she's never had a reason to believe speaking would help." Name landed in the room. Evelyn and Caleb looked at each other. "Forsyth found the Reeves land transaction," Caleb said to Margaret carefully. "He thinks it was acquired through fraud." Margaret set down her coffee cup very slowly. "I've thought the same thing for 15 years, she said. "I couldn't prove it. Neither could anyone else who noticed it." She looked at Caleb. "If your lawyer can prove it, it changes everything," Caleb said. "Changes more than everything," Margaret said. "It changes 20 years. The weight of that settled over all 3 of them. Then Evelyn said, "Can you get me to Clara Reeves today?" Margaret looked at her. "You want to talk to her yourself." "She's not going to trust a lawyer she's never met," Evelyn said. "She might trust another woman who's been on the wrong end of Gerald Marsh's version of how things work." Margaret studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "I can get you to her. But you need to understand this woman has been afraid for 15 years. You can't push her. You can only tell her the truth and let her decide." "That's all I've ever asked anyone to do for me," Evelyn said. They rode down to Millhaven together, Evelyn and Margaret, which was its own kind of statement. A woman Gerald Marsh had accused of theft riding openly into his town in broad daylight, as though she had not only the right but the nerve. People saw her. She saw them see her. She rode with her back straight and her chin level, and she did not look away from a single face. Caleb stayed on the mountain. This had been agreed between them before she left, and agreeing to it had been one of the harder things he'd done since she arrived, because every instinct in him said to go with her, be between her and whatever was coming. But she had said clearly and without ambiguity, Clara Reeves will not talk freely if there's a man in the room. And I need her to talk freely. And he had known she was right, which was why it cost him. Here. He worked. He worked hard the way you do when you're burning off something that has nowhere else to go. He split wood. He mended the fence along the north side of the paddock that had been needing attention for 2 months. He checked on the horses, and Sunday pressed her nose against his shoulder the way she'd started doing, which was Evelyn's doing. And he stood there with his hand on the mare's neck and tried not to think about every possible thing that could go wrong in Millhaven before sundown. It was mid-afternoon when Cotton Briggs appeared. Not alone this time, and not with Petey Dunn's variety of men. Cotton had brought 4 riders, and these 4 were a different category, quieter, harder, the kind of men who weren't paid to threaten, but to follow through. Caleb knew the difference on sight. He was at the fence when they rode in. He didn't move toward them. He waited. Cotton pulled up and looked at him with something Caleb hadn't seen on his face before. It wasn't calculation. It was closer to apology, which was more alarming than anything else he might have brought. Walker, Cotton said, I need you to hear me on something. Say it. Gerald knows about the Denver lawyer. He knows about the Reeves inquiry. Knows Evelyn went to Millhaven today. Cotton paused. He also knows something that you may not know yet. Caleb kept his expression neutral. What? The circuit judge received a communication this morning, Cotton said. From the county recorder. The warrant for Evelyn's arrest has been moved up. It's not Friday anymore. The yard went quiet except for the wind. Today, Cotton said. This afternoon. Gerald filed a supplemental statement saying she was a flight risk. The judge agreed. He looked at Caleb directly, and what was in his eyes was something Caleb hadn't expected to find there, a man who has done a thing for a long time and is tired of it. Yeah, I'm telling you because I have been in Gerald Marsh's employ for 12 years, and I have done a great many things I am not proud of, and there are things I will not do. And I will not watch an innocent woman get arrested for a lie. He exhaled. She needs to be back up this mountain before the deputy reaches town. If maybe 2 hours. Caleb was already moving. He didn't say thank you. There wasn't time. Then he got post-saddled in under 3 minutes, which was fast even for him, and he rode down that mountain at the kind of pace that makes a man speak to his horse the whole way down, not words exactly, just sounds. Language of urging and reassurance that moves between a rider and a horse, when they both understand that the situation calls for everything they have. He hit the edge of Millhaven at a run, and slowed only when he reached the east side of town where Margaret Tilden's note had said Clara Reeves lived. He found them in a small house set back from the road, Margaret Evelyn, and a woman in her 40s with her father's eyes and 15 years of careful silence in every line of her face. All 3 of them looked up when Caleb came through the door, without knocking, breathing hard, still carrying the dust of the trail. I have to go, he said to Evelyn now. She read his face instantly. Without asking why. The warrant, she said. Moved up 2 hours ago, maybe less. Margaret stood. Go, I'll handle what happens in town. Evelyn looked at Clara Reeves. The 2 women had been sitting across from each other, and whatever had passed between them in the last 2 hours was visible in the way Clara was holding herself less tightly than when she'd sat down, and something unlocked that had been locked a very long time. Evelyn said, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry we don't have more time. Clara reached out and took Evelyn's hand. She held it for a moment. Nair. Then she said, quietly but clearly, you come back with your lawyer, Miss Harper. But I'll be here. I've been waiting 15 years to say what I have to say. A beat. Think it's time. Evelyn pressed her hand once. Then she was out the door, hard back up the mountain, and they didn't speak, because there was no breath to spare for speaking, and when they got back to the ranch, and Caleb got the horses settled, they stood in the yard in the last of the afternoon light, and Evelyn put her hands on her knees and breathed. Then she straightened up. She'll testify, she said. Clara Reeves. She'll testify about what happened to her father's land. She has her father's papers letters, a diary, records of payments made before the recorder declared him incompetent. She looked at Caleb. She's been keeping them for 15 years. She never knew if they'd be enough. She thought she was alone. Caleb was quiet for a moment. She's not alone anymore, he said. No, Evelyn said. She's not. They looked at each other in the fading light. Gerald moved the warrant, Caleb said. Someone on his side told him you'd gone to town. None knew. He has people everywhere, Evelyn said. Always known that. I didn't know how many. She paused. Cotton Briggs warned you. That surprises me. Me too, Caleb said. But men who've been carrying something a long time sometimes put it down when they see the chance. She thought about that. What do we do about the warrant? Forsyth gets here tomorrow or the day after. We don't let you go back into town until he does. We don't give them a clean opportunity to serve it. He looked at her. That means staying up here. It means waiting. I'm not good at waiting, she said. I know, he said. Neither am I. Then we'll be bad at it together, she said. And the corner of her mouth moved in that way it sometimes did, the way that had started happening more frequently over the past 3 weeks, and it did something to his chest that he had completely given up trying to ignore. Forsyth arrived the following afternoon. He was younger than Caleb's letters had suggested, somewhere in his mid-30s, slim, with the kind of precise, alert quality that law either develops or destroys in a person, depending on the person. He rode up with a leather satchel and a calm that was recognized as professional rather than natural, which was fine. Professional calm was the right kind for this situation. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened the satchel. Out papers. I've reviewed everything, Forsyth said. Theft charge is thin. Gerald's witnesses are compromised. I've already identified financial relationships between 2 of them and Marsh's cattle operation that a judge outside this county would find disqualifying. He looked at Evelyn. The warrant is legitimate in its form, but illegitimate in its substance. You can challenge it, and I expect to prevail. What I need to know, he paused. Miss Harper, Caleb's letter mentioned a woman named Clara Reeves. She'll testify, Evelyn said. She has documents. Forsyth looked at his papers, then back up. If the Reeves land acquisition is fraudulent, and from what I found, I believe it is, then Gerald Marsh is not simply a man who pressured a woman into an unwanted arrangement. He is a man who built his entire operation on a foundation of fraud. And that changes the nature of every legal proceeding he's been involved in this valley for 20 years. He let that land. This is not a small case anymore, Miss Harper. This is a very large one. The kitchen was very quiet. I know, Evelyn said. Yeah. Are you prepared for what that means? For what he'll do when he understands the scope of what we're bringing? Looked at Forsyth steadily. Mr. Forsyth, I lived in that man's house for 3 years. I know what he is. I am not afraid of what he'll do. A pause. I'm ready for it. I've been ready for it since the day I left. Forsyth looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. All right, he said. Then we go to court. Gerald Marsh found out about Clara Reeves that evening. Caleb didn't know how. He suspected out of betrayal, but because Gerald had ways of knowing things that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with leverage, and leverage was a tool Gerald had been sharpening for 2 decades. Whatever the source, by nightfall Gerald knew, and by nightfall the mountain felt different. Smoke, not the ranch, not the barn. The fire started in the tree line about a quarter mile up from the north fence, a thin tendril of smoke, against the darkening sky that Caleb saw from the paddock. And that sent everything in him to immediate attention. He moved fast. He called to Evelyn through the cabin door fire on the northeast ridge. They in the cabin. And he got the horses out of the barn first, because horses in a fire panic and a panicked horse will hurt itself and anyone near it. And he got them into the far paddock and latched the gate, and then he went toward the fire with 2 water buckets and the single-minded focus of a man who has lived on this land for 15 years and knows exactly what he stands to lose. Fire was small, deliberately small, set at a single point, designed not to consume but to warn. To say, I can reach you here. I can reach what you have built. It took him 40 minutes to contain it. 40 minutes of moving fast in the dark, his lungs full of smoke, his hands blistered by the time it was down to embers. He stood and looked at what remained the scorched earth, the blackened lower branches of 3 pines, the clear mark of a fire that had been set, not started by accident. Walked back to the cabin. Evelyn was in the doorway. She had not stayed inside. She had watched from the threshold, which was close enough to help, if it came to that, and far enough to stay out of the way. When he came back, she looked at his hands and said, come inside." He came inside. She got water. She got the cloth she used for the horses. Easier. She sat across from him at the table and she took his hands, and she cleaned them with the same vehement, careful attention she gave to everything, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Caleb said quietly, he said it. "I know," she said. "Telling us what he's willing to do." "I know." "Evelyn." He waited until she looked up. "This is the point where I need to know something honestly. Is this too much? Because I got into this understanding that it would cost something. I didn't know how much, and you didn't ask for any of this. You asked for somewhere to stand, not for a fight that goes this far." She held his gaze. "Are you asking me if I want to leave?" she said. "I'm asking if you want the choice." She set down the cloth. "Knee." She looked at his hands, blistered, steady, the hands of a man who had built something out of the mountain and had just spent 40 minutes keeping it from burning. She looked up at him. "I have spent my entire adult life," she said, "being told what I am not. What I am not worth. What I am not capable of choosing for myself." Her voice was quiet and absolutely clear. "I am not leaving. I am not leaving because Gerald Marsh is afraid of what we found and afraid people will see who he is, and if there is one thing in my life I have always wanted, it is for people to see who he is." She paused. "And I am not leaving," because she stopped. He waited. "Because this is the first place," she said, "that I have ever felt like I was allowed to take up space. And I'm not giving that back." The cabin held them both in the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of everything, that had been building since a dusty street in Millhaven, and a woman holding a canvas bag and a man who had stepped forward without quite knowing why. He turned his hands over, carefully, and held hers. She didn't pull back. "Then we don't give anything back," he said. She looked at their hands, then at him. "No," she agreed. "We don't." What none of them knew, not Caleb, not Evelyn, not Forsyth asleep in the spare room, was that Cotton Briggs had not gone home that night after delivering his warning. He had gone instead to find Gerald, and he had resigned. He had put 12 years on the table and walked away from them, and the reason he had done it was something he had not said to Caleb and had not said to anyone, which was that the fire on Northeast Ridge was something Gerald had not ordered. Gerald had ordered a warning delivered. Cotton had understood it to mean something implicit, and the men had acted on that implication. But setting fire to a man's land, to a man's trees, a work of 15 years that was a line that Cotton Briggs, who had done many things he wasn't proud of, was not willing to be on the right side of. He had told Gerald so. Gerald had said quiet that Cotton was welcome to leave. And Cotton had left. He was, as of that night, a man without employment, and without the protection of the most powerful figure in the valley. He was also, for the first time in 12 years, a man who could sleep. He found Forsyth in the morning. He had things to say that Forsyth needed to hear. And when Caleb came in from the paddock and found Cotton Briggs sitting at his kitchen table across from his lawyer, with Evelyn standing behind Forsyth with her arms crossed, and the expression of a woman watching a door open that she had not expected to open, Caleb stopped in the doorway. Cotton looked at him. "I know," Cotton said. "I know what I am to you and what I've been. I'm not here asking for anything." A pause. "But I was in that office for 12 years. I have a very good memory, and I think your lawyer might want to hear what I remember." Looked at Forsyth. Forsyth had his pen already in his hand. Eb walked inside and closed the door. The mountain was still burning in one small, blackened corner of the Northeast Ridge. But for the first time since the morning in Millhaven, when he had stepped forward in a dusty street, Caleb Walker felt the weight shift. Nay, felt the tide, which had been running in one direction for a month, begin, slowly, undeniably to turn. Gerald Marsh had spent 20 years building a kingdom on a lie. The man who had helped him build it, had just walked through Caleb's door. And everything was about to come apart. Cotton Briggs talked for 3 hours. Forsyth wrote without stopping, filling page after page in the small, precise handwriting of a man who understood that every word being said was worth preserving. Evelyn sat across the table and listened without interrupting, which cost her something. Because there were moments in Cotton's accounting when her jaw went tight and her hands pressed flat against the tabletop, and she had to make a deliberate choice not to speak. Caleb stood near the door for the first hour, then pulled up a chair for the second, then stopped noticing where he was sitting in the third, because Cotton had moved past the Reeves land and into territory that was worse. Gerald Marsh had done the Reeves acquisition in 1871. That was where it started, but it was not where it ended. As a widow named Hester Colm, who had lost her water rights in 1876 through a document she had signed, believing it was a tax form. There was a rancher named Boyd Whitaker, who had borrowed money from Gerald at terms he hadn't fully understood and lost his south pasture when he couldn't pay. There was a business arrangement in 1879 involving a man who had come to Millhaven to open a feed store and had left 8 months later with nothing, convinced he had failed through his own mismanagement. Not knowing that the supplier contracts Gerald had helped him secure had been quietly sabotaged from the beginning. Method after method. Always careful. Always deniable. Always leaving the victim, believing their own misfortune was their own fault. When Cotton finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Forsyth looked up from his papers. "Mr. Briggs, I need to ask you something directly." "Ask it. Why did you stay for 12 years? Cotton looked at his hands on the table. He was quiet for a moment, because I kept telling myself that what I was involved in was business. The valley needed a strong hand. That Gerald built things, roads, the school addition, the new church roof, and that building things counted for something. He paused. And because I was afraid. I knew enough to be afraid of what happened to people who crossed him. He looked up. I watched what he did to Evelyn Harper over 3 years. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself she'd be fine. He looked at Evelyn directly. I was wrong, and I am sorry for that, for all of it. Evelyn held his gaze for a long moment. I believe you, she said. It was not warm, and it was not forgiveness, and it was exactly what it needed, to be the honest acknowledgement of a man who had done wrong and was choosing, but not too late, do right. Cotton nodded. That was enough for him, maybe more than he deserved. Gathered his papers. All right, he said. We go to court Thursday morning. I'll file the counter motion today, which will void the warrant pending the hearing. The theft charge falls apart without its witnesses, and I will spend tomorrow making certain those witnesses understand the legal consequences of perjury. He looked around the table. Gerald will know by tonight that Cotton has spoken to us. Which means he'll do something before Thursday, Caleb said. Forsyth said, He will. What do we do? We don't give him anything to work with, Forsyth said. Miss Harper stays on this mountain, Mr. Briggs. He looked at Cotton. Need you somewhere. Gerald can't reach you tonight. Do you have somewhere to go? I've got a brother in Telluride, Cotton said. Oh, tonight, Forsyth said. Don't tell anyone you're going except us. Be back in Millhaven by Wednesday evening. I need you in that courtroom Thursday morning. Cotton stood. He put his hat on. He looked at Caleb. I know this doesn't fix what I was part of, he said. No, Caleb said, it doesn't. He let a beat pass. It's something, and something is where things start. Cotton walked out. The sound of his horse faded down the mountain trail. Forsyth closed his satchel. He looked at both of them, Caleb, Evelyn, with the careful, assessing expression of a man who needs to know whether his clients are solid enough to hold through what comes next. He said. Whatever Gerald does between now and then you hold. Hold, Caleb said. Forsyth nodded and went to the spare room. Caleb and Evelyn sat at the empty table. "He's going to come at us tonight," Evelyn said. Caleb said, "So we're ready tonight." She looked at him. How ready can two people be against everything Gerald Marsh can bring? Thought about that honestly. "Ready enough," he said. "We're smart about it." He met her eyes. "And we're smart. Both of us. That's something he hasn't counted on from the beginning, that you and I together are smarter than anything he's used to dealing with." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You're the first person who has ever said you and I together and meant it as a strength." He didn't have a response for that. It was too true to need one. Gerald moved that night. Not with fire this time. Not with P.D. Dunn's variety of men. What Gerald did was more sophisticated and therefore more dangerous. He sent a woman. Her name was Caroline Prentice, and she arrived at the mountain ranch just after sunset, carrying a basket covered with a cloth and wearing the expression of someone doing a neighborly thing. She was somewhere in her 40s, pleasant-faced, and she was one of the women who had stood in the crowd in Millhaven the day Caleb stepped forward, one of the ones who hadn't laughed, but hadn't spoken either. Caleb answered the door. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I hope I'm not disturbing. I've come to speak with Miss Harper, if she's willing. I have some things I'd like to say. To her." Caleb looked at her. He looked at the basket. He looked at her face. "What kind of things?" he said. "Personal things," she said, "between women. I don't mean any harm, Mr. Walker. I promise you that." He thought about it. He was not a man who trusted easily, and 3 weeks of Gerald Marsh's methods had not improved his inclination. But there was something in Caroline Prentice's face that was genuine, a discomfort, a guilt, that Caleb recognized as the real thing because he'd seen its opposite enough times to know the difference. He stepped back and called Evelyn. Evelyn came to the door. She looked at Caroline Prentice. "Mrs. Prentice," she said. Carefully, Caroline held out the basket. "I brought some things. Preserves. It's not a bribe. It's just something to do with my hands while I say what I came to say." Evelyn took the basket. She looked at Caleb. He said, "I'll be outside." He went to the porch and stayed close enough to hear if something went wrong and far enough away to give them what the moment required. Inside, he could hear voices but not words for about 10 minutes. Then the voices got louder. Then they went quiet again. Then a door opened and Caroline Prentice came out. Her eyes were red. She looked at Caleb. "I am one of Gerald Marsh's witnesses," she said. "He told me what to say. He told me I had seen Evelyn in his office." She stopped. She breathed. "I was never in a position to say no to Gerald Marsh. My husband owes him money. I was afraid." She looked at Caleb steadily. "I'm not going to say it. What he told me to say. I'm going to tell your lawyer the truth, which is that I will not commit perjury for a man who has made this valley into something that everyone is afraid of." Silence on the porch was very still. "Mrs. Prentice," Caleb said. "Does Gerald know you're here?" "No," she said. "And when he finds out I've been here, my husband's debt will likely come due immediately." She said it without flinching. "That's what it costs. I've decided it's worth the cost." "Tell Forsyth," Caleb said. "Tonight if you can. He's the lawyer. He'll know how to protect you." She nodded. She went back down the trail. Caleb went back inside. Evelyn was standing at the table, with her hands pressed flat the way they did when she was working through something enormous. "She told," Caleb said. "She told me." Evelyn looked up. "She also told me something else. Something Gerald didn't intend to send with her." She paused. "Gerald has a second set of books, financial records. Everything the official records don't show: the Reeves acquisition, the Colm water rights, the Whitaker arrangement. All of it. He keeps them in a lockbox in his office." She met his eyes. "Caroline has seen it. She's seen him with it. She doesn't know exactly where in the office, but she knows it exists." Caleb went very still. If Forsyth could subpoena that box, it would be everything, Evelyn said. It would be the case, complete. Not just testimony. In Gerald's own hand. They looked at each other. "He'll move it," Caleb said. The moment he knows we know about it. How long do we have? Until he finds out Caroline came here, Caleb said. Which is tonight, Evelyn said. Maybe by morning. Caleb was already moving toward the spare room. He knocked on the door. Forsyth, I need you up. Forsyth filed for the subpoena at 7 in the morning. B. Not in Millhaven. In the next county, before a judge who did not eat at Gerald Marsh's table and did not owe Gerald Marsh favors, a judge named Alderman, who had a reputation for two things: impatience with wasted time and absolute intolerance for fraud. Scythe rode through the night to get there. Caleb and Evelyn waited on the mountain. The waiting was its own kind of work. Evelyn moved through the morning the way she moved through everything practically, without stillness. Because stillness was where fear lived, and she had learned a long time ago not to give fear a comfortable place to settle. She worked with the horses. She made bread, which she had not made before, at the ranch, and the smell of it filled the cabin in the way that smells sometimes do, when a place has been without them long enough that their return means something beyond the thing itself. And Caleb worked the fence. He came in at midday and found bread on the table and coffee on the stove, and Evelyn at the window watched the trail below with the particular quality of attention that is not fear but is what comes before fear if something appears. Nothing yet, she said. It's early, he said. She turned from the window. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had been doing more openly lately, without the force of the wariness that had been there at the beginning. It was still there. He suspected it would always be there to some degree, which was not something to fix, but something to earn against, incrementally, honestly. Caleb, she said. Yes, whatever happened Thursday. She stopped. At it again. I need you to know that what you did, what you've done, I have never had anyone. She stopped again, and he could see it cost her. This particular honesty, more than most. Don't have to say it, he said. I do, she said. Because I don't say things I don't mean, and I mean this. She held his gaze. You stepped forward in that street for a woman you didn't know. And you have not stepped back once since. Not when Gerald threatened you, not when Petey came up the mountain, not when the fire. Her voice stopped on the word fire, and she pushed through it. You have not once made me feel like a burden, and I have been a burden. Objectively. I have brought you debt and threats and fire and a lawsuit. I know that. Let me finish, she said quietly. I know that, and you have not once made me feel like I was more trouble than I was worth. And that is the rarest thing anyone has ever done for me. I need you to know that I see it, that it is not going unnoticed. She looked at him. Whatever happens Thursday, that's true regardless. Gavin was very quiet. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, You're not a burden. You never were. You are the reason this place feels like something worth defending. He paused. And I want you to know I am not doing this because I want something from you. I'm not keeping a ledger. You don't owe me anything at the end of this, no matter how it goes. I know, she said. That's why I can say what I said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The space between them, which had been narrowing for weeks, the way the distance between two careful people narrows, when each of them stops pretending not to notice, went very quiet. Then a rider came hard up the trail. Both of them moved to the window. It was Margaret Tilden's boy, the same one who had come before. He was riding like it mattered. Caleb went to the door. Roy pulled up breathless. Mr. Walker, Mrs. Tilden sent me. She says to tell you Gerald Marsh went to his office this morning and came out with a lockbox and put it in his wagon and drove toward the county line. The words hit the room like a stone into still water. When, Caleb said, maybe less. Does Forsyth know? Mrs. Tilden sent another rider to the next county. She doesn't know if he got there in time. Caleb looked at Evelyn. Evelyn's face had gone very still, not the controlled stillness of someone managing fear, but the deeper stillness of someone calculating fast. He's moving the books, she said. If he gets them across the county line. Scythe's subpoena has no reach there. She was thinking. Her eyes were moving the way eyes do when a person's going through options fast. Unless she stopped, unless what? Caleb said. Unless someone intercepts him before he gets there. She looked at Caleb. How well do you know the roads between here and the county line? Understood immediately. Better than Gerald does. There's a shortcut, through the North Pass. I know the North Pass, he said. I've taken it 100 times. Gerald takes the road. The road adds 40 minutes. They looked at each other. Caleb, she said. I can't take the box, he said. That's theft. That undoes everything. You don't have to take the box, she said. You just have to slow him down long enough for Forsyth to get the subpoena served. She held his eyes. Can you do that? He was already moving. Stay inside, he said. Don't open the door for anyone but Forsyth or Margaret. Go, she said. He went. The North Pass was steep and the summer ground was dry, which meant Post could move fast if Caleb gave him the rein and trusted him, and Caleb trusted him absolutely. They went up and over the ridge in a time that would have seemed reckless to anyone watching who didn't know the ground. And they came down the other side onto the main valley road, about a mile ahead of the point where Gerald's wagon would have reached. Abe pulled Post up in the middle of the road. He waited. 8 minutes. Then the wagon came around the bend, Gerald driving, one man beside him on the seat, another riding behind. Gerald pulled the horses up hard when he saw Caleb blocking the road. The two men with Gerald put their hands near their holsters. Caleb did not move. Walker, Gerald said. His voice was tight, stripped of the courthouse politeness he'd been wearing for weeks. This was the voice underneath, flatter, colder. Get out of my road. Is a county road, Caleb said. You don't own it. It will have you arrested. Caleb said. On a public road. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the lockbox sitting the wagon bed, not even covered, because Gerald had moved too fast to think about appearances. He looked back at Gerald. Nice box you've got there. Gerald's face went dark. You have no idea what you are doing. I've got a general sense of it, Caleb said. The man on the seat beside Gerald said something low. Gerald shook his head once, sharply. Walker. Gerald's voice had dropped into something that was not quite a threat, but was the thing that comes just before one. You are one man, on a road, with nothing, whatever you think you are accomplishing right now. Accomplishing about 40 minutes, Caleb said simply. Gerald stared at him, and then the sound of hoofbeats came from the direction of Millhaven, not one horse but two, moving fast, coming up the road from behind Gerald's wagon. Everyone turned. Forsyth came around the bend, and beside him, was a man. Caleb didn't know, a tall man in a coat that meant official business, carrying a leather document case. The county sheriff's deputy from the next jurisdiction, who had received a subpoena that morning from a judge named Alderman, who did not eat at Gerald Marsh's table. Gerald turned back to Caleb. The look on his face was not anger. It was something older and more honest, the particular action of a man who has spent 20 years winning and has just understood, for the first time, what losing feels like when it arrives. You planned this, Gerald said, not loud, barely above a breath. We planned this, Caleb said. There's a difference. Deputy reached the wagon and said the words that needed to be said. Gerald's hands went to the reins, and then away from them. The lockbox was removed from the wagon under the deputy's authority and placed in the deputy's care. Gerald sat in the wagon with his hands in his lap. He looked like a man who had just watched the ground he had been standing on for 20 years open up beneath him. Forsyth pulled up beside Caleb. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the lockbox, now secured with the deputy. At Caleb. You held him, Forsyth said. Minutes, Caleb said. That was enough. Forsyth exhaled. The judge signed the subpoena on the basis of Cotton's testimony and Caroline Prentice's affidavit, which she gave this morning before Gerald knew what she'd told you. He looked at Gerald. It's over, Mr. Marsh. Gerald said nothing. He had nothing left to say. Thursday came. The courtroom in Millhaven was not a formal courthouse. It was the largest room in the hotel, cleared of its furniture and arranged with chairs and a table for the judge. because Millhaven had never been important enough to warrant a dedicated courthouse, which was one of the reasons Gerald had been able to operate the way he had for so long. That morning, it was standing room only. Margaret Tilden was there. Ruth Ferris was there. Holcomb from the dry goods sat in the second row with his hands clasped, and the expression of a man who has made a decision about his own conscience and intends to stick to it. Clara Reeves sat near the back, with a bundle of her father's papers on her lap, tied with string, 15 years of waiting in a neat package. Caroline Prentice sat beside her husband, who had received a visit from Forsyth the evening before that had significantly altered his understanding of his financial situation. Cotton Briggs sat near the front and did not look at Gerald Marsh. Gerald sat at a table with a lawyer who had ridden in from 2 counties away, and who, it was becoming clear from his expression, had not been given fully accurate information about the strength of his client's position. Evelyn walked in with Caleb beside her. The room changed when she walked in. Not dramatically, but people turned. People who had stood in a street and laughed, or stood in a street and said nothing, or stood at the edges of Gerald Marsh's influence for 20 years and kept their heads down and their opinions to themselves. They turned. And they looked at her, and what was in their faces was complicated guilt in some calculation in others, and, in a few, something simpler and more important than either. Evelyn did not look at any of them. She looked straight ahead. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table in front of her, and she breathed. Caleb sat beside her. She did not look at him, but under the table, her hand found his, and she held it once brief, hard, certain, and then let go. The judge called the proceeding to order. What followed 4 hours and covered 20 years of Gerald Marsh's history in the Millhaven Valley, and it was, by every legal measure, demolition. Forsyth presented the Reeves documentation. He presented Cotton's testimony, presented Caroline Prentice's affidavit, and Holcomb's corrected account, and Clara Reeves's father's letters, which were read aloud in the room, and which created a silence of the particular kind that happens when a community hears its own history told honestly for the first time. Gerald's lawyer objected. He objected repeatedly, in the way lawyers object when they have nothing else to offer. The judge alderman, who had agreed to preside in Millhaven for this hearing specifically because of the cross-county nature of the subpoena, sustained very few of them. The lockbox was opened. Gerald's second set of books were laid out. Gerald Marsh's lawyer stopped objecting. Gerald himself, who had not spoken since the road the day before, looked at the books open on the table and looked at the judge, and did something that nobody in that room had ever seen Gerald Marsh do. He looked away. The theft charge against Evelyn Harper was dismissed in the first 20 minutes. Forsyth didn't even have to argue it. Gerald's own lawyer conceded it, once the context of the broader fraud became clear. Because attaching his client to a provably false accusation in the middle of a proceeding about genuine crimes was not a position any lawyer wanted to defend. The rest of the hearing was about Gerald. At the end of 4 hours, Judge Alderman said a number of things, clearly and without ceremony, that added up to this. Gerald Marsh would be referred to the territorial court for formal prosecution on multiple counts of fraud. His land holdings would be subject to review. The Reeves parcel would be returned to Clara Reeves, pending territorial court confirmation. All debts and arrangements executed under fraudulent pretenses would be subject to challenge. Then he looked up from his papers. "And I want to say something that is not a legal finding," Alderman said. "It is an observation. The woman sitting at that table," he looked at Evelyn, "came into this proceeding facing a false criminal charge. Knew she is leaving it with her name cleared and her character intact. In my experience, that is not a common outcome for someone in her position. It is the outcome here because she had the courage to stand against something that had been standing unchallenged in this valley for 2 decades. He looked around the room. That should tell everyone in this room something about what courage costs and what it produces. He gathered his papers and stood. He exhaled. Outside, afterward, in the clear summer air, people came to Evelyn one by one. Not all of them, not the ones who had laughed the loudest. But enough. Margaret Tilden, who hugged her without warning and was not a woman who hugged without meaning it. Ruth Ferris, who shook her hand and said, "My husband's land," and couldn't finish the sentence, and didn't need to. But Clara Reeves, who held Evelyn's hands in both of hers and said only, "Thank you," which carried the weight of 15 years. Oakham came last. He stood in front of Evelyn with his hat in his hands and said, "I inflated the number. Your debt. Gerald told me to, and I did it, and I am sorry for it." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. Ape settled it at the inflated number. "So you kept the difference." She paused. "Give it to Clara Reeves." "Miss Harper." "Give it to Clara Reeves," she said again, not unkindly. "Just clearly. That seems about right." Holcomb put his hat back on and nodded and went to find Clara Reeves. Caleb had been standing a few feet away through all of this, the way he'd been standing near things since the beginning, close enough to matter, far enough to give her space to be what she was, without his shadow over it. When the last person had come and gone, she turned and found him. Looked at him for a long moment. "It's over," she said. "The legal part," he said. Yes, she understood what he meant. "The rest of it is just living." She said the word living like someone who has been holding it at a distance and is now carefully allowing it closer. He looked at her. At the courthouse door behind her. At the street where a month ago she had stood holding a canvas bag while a crowd laughed. "You're standing in the same street," he said. She turned and looked at the street. Then back at him. "It feels different," she said. "You're different in it," he said. She held his gaze for a long quiet moment. "What happens now?" she said. Not urgently, not afraid. "Just asking." He looked at her with the directness he had brought to everything since the beginning, the kind that didn't perform and didn't deflect. "That's yours to decide," he said. "It always was." A pause. "But I'll tell you what I'd like, if you're asking." "I'm asking," she said. "I'd like you to come back up that mountain," he said. "Not because you have nowhere else to go. Because you choose to. Because Sunday needs someone who knows how to make her trust things. And because," he stopped, "because I have spent 15 years building something on that mountain, and I am only now understanding what I was building it for." The street of Millhaven held them. Around them, the town moved people who had come out of a courtroom, carrying new information about the place they lived and what it had been built on, each of them working out privately what that meant for who they intended to be going forward. Evelyn Harper stood in the middle of that street. She had arrived in it a month ago with a canvas bag and nothing else. She stood in it now with her name cleared, her debt settled, her testimony given, and a man beside her who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. She looked at him. "All right, Caleb Walker," she said. Not yes. Something better than yes. The kind of answer that has done the work of deciding and is not looking back. "Let's go home." They rode back up the mountain in the late afternoon, and neither of them spoke much, and that was all right. The silence between them had changed. It had been changing for weeks, the way the water changes when it moves from cold to warm, not all at once, not with any single moment you could point to, but gradually, undeniably, until one day you put your hand in and realize it is something different than it was. The silence at the beginning had been two strangers being careful. Silence was something that had earned itself. Evelyn rode Sunday. She had not asked. She had simply gone to the paddock when they were ready to leave Millhaven and put her hand on Sunday's neck and looked Caleb, and he had nodded, and that was that. Moved under her with the settled, forward ease of an animal that has decided it is safe to trust, which was something Caleb had spent 3 months trying to achieve, and Evelyn had accomplished in 3 weeks, without appearing to try at all. He didn't say anything about that either. When they came up the trail and the ranch came into view, Evelyn did something she hadn't done before. She stopped Sunday at the top of the last rise and sat there for a moment, looking at the cabin, the barn, the paddock fence, the garden with its 3 rows of late-season beans that were, against reasonable probability, actually coming up, and she sat there long enough that Caleb pulled post up beside her and followed her gaze. "It," he said. "Nothing." Then, everything. She looked at him. Keep expecting it to feel temporary, does it? She thought about it honestly, the way she did everything. Less than it did yesterday, she said. He looked at the ranch. Good, he said. They rode in. The first week after the hearing moved differently than the weeks before it. The weight that had been sitting over the ranch, the vigilance, the waiting for the next thing Gerald would send up the mountain, lifted in the way that weights lift when a threat has been formally named and addressed. Not all at once, not without leaving a mark, but genuinely. And Caleb noticed it in the mornings first. He had been waking for weeks with the particular alertness of a man who has learned to treat quiet as suspicious, scanning for sounds that shouldn't be there before he was fully awake. The first morning after the hearing, he woke up and the alertness was still there, and then slowly, his mind confirmed that there was nothing to find, and he lay in the quiet for a full 10 minutes, simply breathing. Which was something he had not done in longer than he could remember. Evelyn noticed it in herself differently. She noticed it when she was at the fence with Sunday, and realized she had not checked the trail below in over an hour. She noticed it when she was making breakfast and caught herself humming, which stopped her cold for a moment, because she couldn't recall the last time she had hummed anything, and had not noticed herself doing it. She mentioned it to Caleb at breakfast. I was humming, she said. I didn't realize. He looked up from his coffee. What song? I don't know. Something my mother used to sing. She paused. She died 3 years ago. I haven't thought about that song since. He held her gaze quietly. What was she like? Evelyn looked at her plate. Not with grief, or not only with grief. With something more complex, the kind of remembering that has love and loss so thoroughly mixed together you can't separate them. She was practical, Evelyn said. She never had enough, and she never complained about not having enough. She just worked. She made things out of whatever was available, and she didn't mourn what wasn't. She paused. She would have liked you. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then why? Because you're the same. You don't perform your goodness. Just do it, and then move on to the next thing. She looked at him directly. Most people who are good want you to notice. You seem almost annoyed by the idea. He almost smiled. I'm not annoyed by it. You're uncomfortable with it. That's different, he said. Is it? He thought about it. A man who does a thing because he wants to be seen doing it is doing a different thing than a man who just does it, he said. I'd rather just do it. She looked at him for a long moment. My mother would definitely have liked you, she said. Forsyth sent a letter 8 days after the hearing. It was thorough and precise in the way Forsyth's communications always were, and it contained several developments. The territorial court had accepted the referral. Gerald Marsh had retained new counsel, expensive counsel from Denver, which suggested he understood the seriousness of what was coming. Reeves' parcel transfer was proceeding. 3 other Valley landowners, emboldened by the hearing, had come forward with their own accounts of irregular transactions with Gerald, which meant the territorial case was growing larger than any single complaint. And at the bottom of the letter, a paragraph that Caleb read twice and then handed to Evelyn without comment. Read it. Then she read it again. It said a man named Gerald Marsh, through his new counsel, has made a settlement inquiry regarding Miss Harper specifically. He is prepared to offer a sum of money. Forsyth named the figure in exchange for Miss Harper agreeing not to testify in the territorial proceedings. The offer is legally hers to accept or decline. My recommendation as her attorney is that she decline. Her testimony is central to the case, and the settlement figure, while substantial, does not reflect the value of what she provides to the prosecution, nor does it reflect what she is owed for what was done to her. But this is her decision. Evelyn put the letter on the table. Caleb watched her. She was quiet for a long time, not the calculating quiet of working through options, but the deeper quiet of someone who has already decided and is making sure the decision is solid before she says it out loud. No, she said, one word, clean. You're certain, Caleb said. Not challenging her, confirming. He wants to buy my silence because he knows my testimony finishes him, she said. He has been buying people's silence in this valley for 20 years. I am not going to be one more. She looked at Caleb. Whatever the number is, it isn't enough. There is no number. Abe nodded once. All right, Forsyth, he said. Tell him thank you, she said, for asking instead of deciding. Yeah, he wrote the letter that afternoon. What came back from the valley in the days that followed was not dramatic. It was the slow movement of a community working out what it believed, now that the structure it had been organized around had collapsed. People made decisions, small ones mostly, that accumulated. Holcomb had given the inflated debt difference to Clara Reeves, as Evelyn had asked. Clara Reeves had used part of it to repair the fence on her father's land, which was now being formally returned to her, and had used another part to pay off a debt she had been carrying since her father's decline. She sent Evelyn a note that said only, "The fence is fixed. Land is ours again. I don't have words for the rest of it, so I won't try." Ruth Ferris's husband filed a formal challenge to the terms of the arrangement that had cost them the south pasture. Forsyth took the case on the basis of the Marsh proceedings. Wrote to Caleb that he expected to prevail. Caroline Prentice's husband received a visit from Forsyth, explaining that several of Gerald's outstanding debt instruments were under review for fraudulent terms, and that his debt in particular appeared to fall into that category, and that there was a reasonable possibility it would be substantially reduced or voided entirely by the territorial court. He came home that evening and sat at his kitchen table and put his head in his hands, and Caroline sat across from him and didn't say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. And Cotton Briggs came back from Telluride. He came up the mountain on a Tuesday with no particular announcement, just rode up the trail and found Caleb at the paddock and dismounted and stood there with his hat in his hands. "I need work," Cotton said. "I've got 12 years of ranch management experience, and no one in this valley who'll hire me right now on account of my history." He looked at Caleb directly. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for the chance to do something I'm not ashamed of." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. "The north fence needs rebuilding," Caleb said. "Damage. It's about 2 weeks of work. I can do that. After that, I don't know yet. We'd figure it out as we go." "That's fair," Cotton said. "It's not generosity," Caleb said. "Need the fence fixed, and you're someone who knows how to fix things." "That's the whole of it." Cotton nodded. "That's enough." He started the next morning. Evelyn watched Cotton work on the fence from the paddock on the third day, while she was working with Sunday on leading exercises. She watched him for a while, his method, his pace, the way he handled the posts and the wire with the efficiency of someone who has done physical work long enough that it lives in his hands rather than his head. She walked over at midday when he stopped. He looked up. He clearly wasn't sure what was coming. "You did a good thing," she said. "I know it cost you." Cotton held her gaze. "It didn't cost me enough, not compared to what I was part of." "No," she agreed, "it didn't. But you did it anyway." "That matters." He looked at the fence post in his hands. "Miss Harper," he said, "I heard Gerald say things about you in that house over 3 years that I should have spoken against." "I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my place." He looked up. "I'm going to have to live with that." "Yes," she said simply. "It will." She looked at him for a moment. "How you live with it is your business. What I'll say is the man I see fixing that fence is a different kind of man than the one who didn't speak. I think you know that too." She went back to Sunday. Cotton stood at the fence post for a moment. Then he drove it into the ground and moved to the next one. The territorial court date was set for October. Forsyth came up to the ranch one evening in late August to go over what Evelyn's testimony would cover. And they sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, while he walked her through the questions, and she answered them with the directness and precision that had characterized everything she did. Caleb sat at the other end of the table and read and did not offer opinions, because she didn't need his opinions and she didn't need him to perform concern. She needed him to be in the room, which was different and was something he understood. At the end of the session, Forsyth closed his case notes. "You're a very strong witness," he said to Evelyn. "Yeah, I want you to know that. I've worked with many people who have gone through things comparable to what you've gone through, and the instinct for most of them is to diminish it when they're in front of a court. Make it smaller than it was so it's easier to say. You don't do that. There's no point in making it smaller," Evelyn said. It was what it was. Making it smaller wouldn't make it less true. It would just make it less useful. Forsyth looked at her. Caleb, then back. "The two of you are a very unusual pair," he said, not unkindly. "Where?" Caleb said. Forsyth left. The cabin was quiet. Evelyn looked at the table where the case notes had been, then at Caleb. "Right," she said. "You know that. About what?" "About us being unusual." She looked at him. "Most men who did what you did would expect something by now. It would have made it clear what they expected." "I'm not most men," he said. "I know." She paused. "That's what makes this, that's what makes you." She stopped. Something moved across her face that he had not seen there before, not the wariness, not the measuring look, not the careful almost smile that had been coming more frequently. Something more open than any of those. Something that had made a decision about itself. "Caleb," she said. "Yes. I'm not going to say what I want to say as a thank you. I want to be clear about that. It's not gratitude. I don't operate from gratitude. And you know that about me." He said. "What I'm going to say, I'm saying. Because it's true, and because I have decided that the version of me who doesn't say true things because she's afraid of how they'll land is not the version of me I want to be anymore." She held his eyes. "I love you. I don't know exactly when it became true." "Yeah. I think it was probably somewhere around the time you paid Petey Dunn more money than he was owed so that he would have no remaining claim on me, and I realized you hadn't told me the full because you didn't want me to feel the weight of it. That's when I think it became true." She paused. "I'm telling you now because October is 2 months away and I have spent enough of my life not saying things I mean." The kitchen held that for a moment. Caleb looked at her. He was quiet long enough that she met his eyes steadily, the way she met everything without flinching, ready for whatever came back. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the morning I watched you stand at that fence for 15 minutes until Sunday came to you." Because you were patient enough to let a frightened animal decide for itself." He paused. I didn't say it because I didn't want to put weight on you before you were ready to carry it. I didn't know when that would be. So I waited. In waiting, she said. "I'm a patient man." "You are," she said. "You are the most patient man I have ever met." The corner of her mouth moved. "It's extremely irritating." He almost laughed. Almost. "I'll work on it." Don't work on it." She stood up from the table and walked around to his side, and she put her hand on his face the way you touch something you have decided belongs to you, carefully and without apology. And he put his hand over hers, and they stayed like that for a moment in the quiet cabin on the quiet mountain, while August sat outside in all its fullness. "We're going to be all right," she said. Not a question. "We're going to be more than all right," he said. She believed him. Not because she needed to, because she had watched him for 2 months, and he had not once said a thing he didn't mean. October came. The territorial court proceedings lasted 4 days, which was 2 days longer than Forsyth had anticipated, and 3 days fewer than Gerald's new lawyer had hoped for. Evelyn testified on the second day. She was in the witness chair for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and she answered every question in the same way she did everything directly and without embellishment, without diminishment, looking at the judge rather than Gerald, which was the right choice not for tactical reasons, but because he was simply not worth her attention anymore. Gerald's lawyer tried 3 different lines of attack on her credibility. First suggested she was motivated by personal grievance. She said, plainly, that she was motivated by the truth, and that the two were not the same thing, and that if he had documentation contradicting her account, he should produce it. He did not produce it. The second suggested her memory of the conversations she had overheard in Gerald's was unreliable. She recited the date, the time of night, specific words used, and the names of the two men speaking. Gerald's lawyer moved on. The third suggested she had something to gain from the proceedings. She said yes, she had something to gain. She had her name to gain, which had been taken from her, and she intended to have it back. Courtroom was very quiet after that. Cotton Briggs testified on the third day. He spoke for 3 hours. Nay, he was specifically methodical in fleeing, and in the way of a man who has made his peace with the consequences and is therefore unafraid of the questions. Testified on the fourth day and read from her father's diary. And there was a particular quality to the silence in that court during those readings, the silence of people hearing a wrong named precisely, finally, after 15 years. Gerald Marsh was convicted on 4 counts of fraud and 2 of coercion. His landholdings were ordered reviewed by the territorial court. 3 parcels, including the Reeves land, were to be returned. Financial penalties were imposed. Further charges from other affected parties were pending. He was not sent to prison that day that would come later, through the additional proceedings that Forsyth had already begun preparing. But he was finished in the valley. That was clear in the way it was clear to everyone in the room simultaneously, in the way a man looks when the structure he has lived inside for 20 years falls away, and what's underneath is just a man, ordinary and diminished and exactly as consequential as his actual choices. Evelyn walked out of that courtroom, with Caleb beside her, and the air outside was the sharp, clean air of an October Colorado afternoon. And she stopped on the steps and tilted her head back, and breathed it in the way a person breathes when they have been holding their breath for a very long time. It's done, he agreed. She lowered her head. She looked at the street, the same street. Always the same street where this had started, where she had stood with a canvas bag and a crowd laughing and a stranger stepping forward for a reason she hadn't understood then and understood completely now. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "What?" "That morning in the street. You said anyone who has survived what she survived deserves more respect than all of us, standing here." She looked at him. "You didn't know anything about me. You didn't know what I'd survived." You just said it. I meant it." "I know," she said. "That's what I keep thinking about. You meant it before you knew me. And then you got to know me and you kept meaning it." She paused. "That's a rare thing, Caleb Walker. I want you to know I understand how rare it is." He looked at her in the October light. "You would have done the same," he said. "Anyone standing in that street." She thought about it. "Maybe," she said. "I hope so." She looked at him. "It was you who did it. So that's what I've got. We're married in the spring." Not in a church, because neither of them was inclined toward ceremony for its own sake, and not with a large gathering, because neither of them had come to this through the kind of life that accumulates large gatherings. Margaret Tilden was there. Clara Reeves was there, standing straighter than she had stood in years, because the land was hers again, and straightness had come back with it. Forsyth attended and was gracious and practical about it, which was his nature. Orton Briggs stood at the back and held his hat in his hands and did not try to occupy more space than he'd been given, which was the right thing. The judge who married them was not Judge Alderman, who had gone back to his own county. It was a territorial justice named Holt who had gray in his beard, and the unhurried manner of a man who has performed many ceremonies and understands that the important part is not the ceremony. He asked them the words. They said the words. It was simple and complete, in the way that simple true things are complete. Afterward, Margaret Tilden hugged Evelyn for a long time. Clara Reeves shook Caleb's hand with both of hers. Forsyth said, "I will be sending a bill," and Caleb said, "I expected nothing less." And they shook hands, like the men they were, people who had been through something genuine together and had come out on the right side of it. Cotton shook Caleb's hand at the door. He looked at Evelyn. Nodded once. She nodded back. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Summer came back to the mountain the way it always did, sudden and full, the way Colorado summers arrive, as though the season has been waiting just out of sight and then decides all at once to be present. Sunday foaled in June. It was Evelyn who noticed first, because she always noticed first with the horses. She came back to the that's light and shook Caleb's awake with the particular urgency of someone who has important news and cannot wait for decorum. Monday, she said. He was up in 30 seconds. They spent 3 hours in the barn, and the foal that arrived was dark like her mother, but smaller than expected and immediately, stubbornly determined to be upright, which made Evelyn laugh with the unguarded, surprised laugh that still caught Caleb somewhere in the chest every time he heard it. She's strong, Evelyn said. Takes after her mother, Caleb said. Evelyn looked at him sideways. That's a compliment, he said. She said, I'll take it. They named the foal Clara, which Evelyn decided without consulting anyone, and Caleb agreed to immediately, because it was the right name and he knew it when he heard it. When they told Clara Reeves, a woman looked at them for a moment, and then pressed her hand over her mouth and turned away for a while. When she turned back, her eyes were bright, and she said, You didn't have to do that, Evelyn said. We know. And that was the end of the conversation. Ranch grew, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way things grow when they are tended with consistency and attention and genuine care, steadily, solidly, with roots that go deep enough to hold when the weather changes. Evelyn took on 2 more horses from people in the valley, who had animals they couldn't manage, animals that had been hurt or frightened or simply mishandled until they had forgotten that humans could be trusted. She worked with them with the same patient, unhurried method she'd used on Sunday, and the results were the same, because the method was honest, and honesty, with horses, is the only thing that works. It got around. It tends to. By the following spring, people were bringing animals from 3 counties out, and Caleb had added 2 more stalls to the barn. And there was a woman from the east edge of the valley who came twice a week to help, and who had her own story of difficulty that Evelyn had heard, and not tried to solve but had simply made space for, which was its own kind of help. Otten stayed. He finished the north fence, and then the east fence, and then the outbuilding that Caleb had been meaning to address for 4 years. And somewhere in the second winter, he stopped being a man doing penance, and became something simpler and more durable, a man doing work he was good at, in a place that didn't require him to be anything other than what he was. He was not the same man who had ridden for Gerald Marsh. He was something newer, less finished maybe, more honest. Margaret Tilden came up the mountain once a month for dinner, which had started as a practical check-in, and had become something else entirely, the kind of evening where people who have been through things together sit at a table and eat and talk about nothing in particular, and the talking about nothing in particular is its own form of recognition that they have arrived somewhere worth arriving at. Ruth Ferris's husband got his south pasture back. It took Forsyth 18 months, but it came back. Holcomb retired from the dry goods and left the store to his nephew and moved to New Mexico, which was something he had apparently always wanted to do and had never given himself permission for. He sent Evelyn a letter from Santa Fe that said, I am growing tomatoes. They are better than anything I grew in Colorado. I think the light is different here. I wanted to tell someone. She read the letter to Caleb at breakfast, and he said, good for him, and meant it without reservation. Gerald Marsh was sentenced in March of the following year. Forsyth sent the letter. Caleb read it. He handed it to Evelyn. She read it and set it down on the table and looked out the window for a long moment, and then she looked back. How do you feel? Caleb asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about things. Like it's over, she said, not like it was fixed. Some things don't get fixed. Clara's father is still gone. All those years are still gone. She paused. But like the wrong thing has stopped, she looked at Caleb. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not nothing. It's a great deal. She looked at him across the table. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask. She said it simply, without the wariness that used to accompany everything she asked. She had been asking things without the wariness for almost a year now, which was something he said every time and did not remark on, because some things are honored by noticing and not by naming. He looked at her. At the kitchen that had become the kitchen he'd always meant to have. At the window behind her, and the barn in the paddock, where Clara the foal was now a leggy yearling who had inherited her mother's wariness and Evelyn's ability to eventually decide to trust. He looked at the woman across the table, who had arrived on his mountain with a canvas bag and nothing else, and had proceeded, in the subsequent months, to fill every empty space in his life with something that turned out to be necessary. Yes, he said, no hesitation, no qualification, yes. Are you? I am, she said. I am Caleb. In a way I didn't know was available to me. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his, outside in the full June morning, on the mountain that had been his for 15 years, and was now theirs. Clara the yearling was running the paddock fence the way young horses run for no reason except that they are alive, and the ground is solid and the air is moving, and all of that together is more than enough reason to move. Stood at the gate, and watched her daughter run. And high on the mountain above the valley of Millhaven, Colorado, in the summer of 1885. Two people, who had each spent a long time believing that belonging was something that happened to other people, sat at a kitchen table with their hands joined and understood, finally and without question, that they had been wrong. A home is not built from wood and stone. It is not built from land or legal victories, or the collapse of the men who tried to take what wasn't theirs. It is built in the space between two people who choose, every morning, to stay. Caleb Walker had stepped forward in a dusty street 2 years ago for a woman he didn't know, and the town had called it foolishness, and Gerald Marsh had called it weakness, and the mountain had called it nothing at all. Because mountains don't judge the choices made at their feet. Evelyn Harper had called it the beginning, and she had been right. She was, as Caleb had come to understand completely and without reservation, almost always right. And the man who had spent 42 years building a life for one person had finally understood what he had actually been building all along. He had been building it for her. She had simply needed time to find her way up the mountain. And now that she was here, neither of them was leaving.